Aloha, and welcome to the online scoping presentation for a statewide rules package related to herbivore management. Thank you so much for joining the Division of Aquatic Resources today to listen to this presentation. Today, you have joined us in taking the first step to discuss the importance of the management of herbivores to improve and enhance our reef ecosystems. My name is Stacia Marcoux, and I'm the Marine Managed Areas Biologist based on Oahu. We'll be going over our mission, coral ecology and herbivores, why herbivore management is important, our rule options, the public process and how to get involved, and finally, after the video presentation, we'll begin the scoping process with breakout groups. Now I will turn it over to Troy Sakihara.
Aloha, my name is Troy Sakihara. I'm the aquatic biologist for the East Hawaii District Office, and today I'll be briefly talking about DAR's mission. At the Division of Aquatic Resources, our mission is to work with the people of Hawaii to manage, conserve, and restore the state's unique aquatic resources and ecosystems for present and future generations. To this end, our division is establishing an overarching management strategy known as 30 by 30 to effectively manage 30% of the state's nearshore waters towards healthy resources and communities by the year 2030. We are responsible for managing all living resources in water, both fresh and saltwater, throughout the state. This includes approximately 3,900 miles of stream that provide nutrients and fresh water, which are critical for native aquatic life in the streams, as well as in the estuaries and coastal habitats. Moving downstream to the coastline, hundreds of stream mouths, embayments, and lagoonal estuaries provide important habitat and food resources for many juvenile and adult sport fishes, many of which feed on limu or algae. Lastly, an estimated 640 square miles of living reef also provide important habitat and food resources for a wide array of fishes and invertebrates, which include a variety of herbivores. Building on Hawaii's traditional management practices and knowledge, along with guidance from fishers, cultural practitioners, and scientific partners, DAR has identified 4 pillars of best management practices needed to achieve our mission. They are place-based planning, monitoring and research, protection and restoration, and pono practices. Place-based planning addresses the marine management areas, or MMAs, that will make up 30% and their effectiveness as a network. This 30% will be measured by island. These MMAs will be planned through community-led efforts, interdisciplinary stakeholder groups, and the best readily available science to pursue healthy habitats and ecosystems and fisheries, while also addressing user conflicts and preservation of cultural and historical sites. New MMAs will have rules unique to each place to accommodate the differences in resources, communities, and stakeholders. These differences in regulations will address the goals and objectives of each area, with local stakeholder input to achieve effective management of each place. There are currently 58 MMAs in existence, encompassing 6% of nearshore water. These existing MMAs will be evaluated to determine if they are effectively managed. We currently have 4 additional pending MMAs for Miloli'i in West Hawaii, Kipahulu in East Maui, Maunalua Bay on the south shore of Oahu, and Mo'omomi on the northern coast of Molokai. As 30 by 30 undergoes planning for these MMAs, DAR will also consider their success as a network. Monitoring provides a snapshot and baseline of each area and tracks how the resource changes with management actions, while research allows us to better understand specific biological and ecological questions that can directly inform better management strategies. If they are not working, monitoring will inform changes to management actions. DAR biologists and staff regularly perform monitoring and research activities to inform the status of estuarine and reef fish populations, invertebrates, coral health, and invasive species. The DAR 30 by 30 plan will be informed by a variety of monitoring efforts in Hawaii, ranging from the Hawaii Monitoring and Research Collaborative to community-based monitoring built on kilo and traditional knowledge of each area. Protection means preventing further degradation of nearshore ecosystems by eliminating threats, while restoration means rebuilding of the resource to improve nearshore habitats towards healthier conditions to speed up recovery. DAR's aquatic invasive species team works to manage invasive species and prevent further introductions. One of the biggest aquatic invasive species efforts by DAR is the removal of invasive algae that grows over reefs and outcompetes coral. The AIS team removes the invasive algae and grows native herbivorous collector urchins to outplant on the reefs after removal. Many threats to nearshore marine ecosystems come from land-based sources, such as sediment and pollution, that enter the ocean from streams and runoff. Protecting nearshore marine resources requires that we manage our places from Mauka to Makai. Lastly, pono practices refer to tools that encourage ocean resource users to behave responsibly. Supporting outreach efforts about rules in existence and rules that may be created will increase compliance and establish kuleana for ocean resources. 30 by 30 will rely on DAR's education and outreach staff and Makai Watch to convey to the public the importance of responsible resource use. DAR will work with our enforcement division, DOCARE, to improve existing regulations and draft new rules with their input. And now I'll be handing it off to Russell Sparks to talk about herbivores and coral reef ecology.
All right, thanks, Troy. As Troy said, my name is Russell Sparks, aquatic biologist for the Maui District Office. And I'll be talking about herbivores, what they are, what role they have on the corals, a little bit about the importance of coral reefs, but more importantly, just to give you some example of why it's so important we better manage our herbivores, particularly when we're thinking about coral reef resiliency into the future. So first off, in a very simple way, herbivores are animals that eat plants. On land, you can think of goats, sheep, cows, things of that sort. But for this management effort, we're really focusing on our nearshore waters. And so we're looking at fish and sea urchins, which feed on seaweed, or what we call limu, or other types of aquatic plants. We're grouping herbivores into 4 functional groups. First one is browsers. Browsers tend to swim around and feed on larger seaweed, what we call macroalgae. Grazers are most of what you see on the reef. They're the smaller fish. They're often in large schools, and they're moving around just kind of cropping the seaweed down, kind of equivalent to how we mow a lawn. They don't remove it from the system, but they always keep it kind of cropped down, cut down lower. Detritivores, interestingly, actually kind of comb through the seaweed or turf, and they're feeding on other things that are found within that. And when they do that, they actually also remove some sediments from the system, and that way are very important to help the coral reefs as well. And then finally, scrapers. Scrapers are things like parrotfish or sea urchins, and they tend to eat everything off the bottom when they're feeding on the algae, and they actually can scrape into the rock itself, and they expose bare substrate, either dead coral or other types of rocks. Very important role, because by doing that, they open up space for corals to later settle and grow. So our management goal is very simply to maintain and recover herbivore populations in an effort to improve reef health so that reefs can be resilient to impacts of climate change. Very simply, more herbivores on the reef, healthier reef. Coral reefs, they're diverse ecosystems. And in Hawaii in particular, it's important to know that they protect our coastlines from storms and erosion. And that value from the protection they provide is equal to about $835 million a year to coastal properties. They're a major food source for subsistence livelihoods, producing about 7 million meals per year. In Hawaii, corals are a critical part of the native Hawaiian traditional culture. There's very many recreational activities that depend on healthy reefs, things that we like to do like snorkeling, diving, fishing, and surfing as well. And if you take all these things together and you consider what the value of reefs are to Hawaii, a study done about 10 years ago now found that it was worth about $33.57 billion per year. So really, we expect it's probably worth more than that in today's dollars. Important to remember that all of these benefits I just talked about our reefs, they depend on our coral reefs remaining healthy and resilient into the future. So let's talk a little bit about coral reef ecology. And the question is, what does a healthy reef look like? And in this picture, it's pretty obvious. The reef on the left is healthy, the reef on the right is degraded, covered with seaweed. But many times in nature, it's not quite that obvious. And the reef may look more or less healthy, but there could be signs that it's becoming degraded, and it could become more and more unstable over time. And the best way to think about this is like a Jenga game. So you remove the blocks, you stack them on top. Over time, the tower gets taller and taller, but it still looks like a tower. Okay, it's still functionally a tower, just like it always was, but it's becoming a little less stable. Then there's key foundational blocks. In this example, things like sea urchins or herbivorous fish. And those are kind of keeping it together, keeping it from crashing. But if you were to pull one of those blocks, or in the case of a reef, you fish down the herbivores to a certain level where they can no longer keep up with the algae, the system crashes, and it can crash very quickly. And we've observed this and we've documented this all over the world, but certainly we've documented it over the last few years in Hawaii as well. So Hawaii's reefs are in danger. Need to do a much better job of just dealing with these current threats that we already know exist, things like pollution and sedimentation and heavy fishing pressure. But we add to that the threats of coral bleaching. And for years and years and years, we've observed coral bleaching all over the world, but haven't really experienced it meaningfully in Hawaii. However, that has recently changed. And 3 out of the last 5 years, we've had statewide mass bleaching events. And this is expected to happen more often in the future. You can see from this graph on the bottom, the periods of times where we've had the bleaching more recently in 2014, 15, and then more recently in 19 are shown on the right part. But previous to that, the only time we exceeded the threshold where bleaching could occur happened back in the 60s. So these are all recent events. The bigger concern we have is if you project out the trends into the future, by the year 2030, we expect to exceed that bleaching threshold every year. And that's very concerning because if corals are not able to, given the chance to adapt and adjust, in which case they bring the bleaching threshold upward, if they're not given that opportunity, then every year they're going to be hit with very significant bleaching events. So the survival of our coral reefs is really going to depend on our ability to reduce stressors, help those corals do better, be more resilient. And part of that is really doing a better job of making sure we have strong, healthy herbivory on the reef, because herbivores help the reefs be resilient by preventing overgrowth of algae. And I'll show to you why that's important. Here's an example of a coral that bleached in 2015. On the top, we first documented it on October 8th, but by October 28th, a couple weeks later, it's starting to show signs that it's dying, right? So if corals bleach and they're staying in that bleached way for too long, if the water temperature stays hot for too long, they will start to die, and we have observed this occurring. After they die, you see on November 17th, seaweed, turf algae, that brown stuff is rapidly starting to fill in on that open space, right? So that space is rapidly filled with seaweed. And then you see in January of 26, the coral's completely gone. You just see no example that the coral was ever even there. It's open space. And luckily, this is a marine reserve with healthy herbivory. So there's not big mats of seaweed that have filled in there. But if you don't have the herbivores around, that space would be filled with taller and bigger turf algae, or in some cases, fleshy seaweed, which we call macroalgae. And that then would prevent new corals from landing and growing there, and or might further stress the neighboring corals in that section of reef. So herbivores are critically important in helping these reef systems recover after bleaching, particularly when bleaching causes mortality of some of the corals. We have years and years of data that suggests really strongly the importance of herbivores on the reef. And this data comes from all over the world, not just Hawaii. But in this one graph, this data was collected about 2 decades ago. We just looked at our marine reserves and we looked at areas outside the marine reserves of similar habitat. And then we were able to look at the proportion or the percentage of macroalgae or seaweed on the bottom. And as you can see, as you move towards the right, as you have higher herbivore biomass on that reef, you have a straight line decline in the amount of macroalgae or seaweed on the reef. Just so happens in areas where fishing is not allowed is where we have the highest herbivorous biomass. And that's why the red squares tend to be the ones that are on the right side that also have lower seaweed. But we can do things other than just fully closing off an area to improve herbivore biomass. And that's part of what we're going to talk about today. We have data from across the state that shows herbivore biomass. We have by species level, et cetera. This is just one graph to show you that the biomass of herbivores varies greatly depending on different parts of the state. And in most cases, the red areas that have the highest biomass of these graphs tend to be remote, isolated, hard to get to, exposed coastlines. The problem that really pops up with us is when you look at some of the more leeward, easy to get to places, those tend to be where most of our coral reefs are as well. And those areas are where herbivore biomass seems to be decreased substantially for what it should be. So there's other evidence that signifies a problem, but we have this data from across the state. And it does suggest we should do more to better manage these herbivore resources. So I want to just end with one case study that was conducted on Maui. This is a management effort. It's called the Kahikili Herbivore Fisheries Management Area, and it's on the kind of the northern west portion of the island, Kaanapali Beach. In 2009, we established this management effort in response to years and years and years of declining coral cover. And we were experiencing, when we go out on the reef, an image just like you're seeing in the backdrop here. The reef was filled with this algae, and it was starting to smother and kind of just stress out the reef and fill in the spaces where the fish would normally live. So the management action was very simple. We created rules that prohibited the taking of parrotfish, surgeonfish, and chubs or nenui, as well as the taking or killing of sea urchins from this section of coastline. We also prohibited the practice of fish feeding, but we did not prohibit fishing. Fishing is very much still allowed and encouraged, as long as you don't take or injure or kill any of those species mentioned. Fast forward 9 years in 2018, and the results are very promising. We found 330% increase in parrotfish, over 4 times as much parrotfish biomass as there was previously. We found surgeonfish increased by 70%. And along with those changes in herbivory, we found concurrent changes with the reef habitat. One, the coral reef decline stabilized. Okay? It hasn't meaningfully increased in coral cover, but it's no longer declining. And that was one of the big concerns we had over that period of time. So it's nice to see that it's at least stabilized at this point. Macroalgae or seaweed has more or less disappeared from the area. And crustose coralline algae, and this is the purple and pink stuff, and I'll show you some examples of that shortly. But this is a type of seaweed that fixes calcium and it grows as a crust on the bottom. That has increased nearly 5 times from what it was before the rules went into effect. This is important because that crustose coralline algae is really important to help new corals settle and grow or existing corals to spread out into the area. So enough with the graphs, let's take a look at what this looks like. Here's one section of this reef in Kahikili in 1999, and you can watch how it changes over time. So in 2001, we had a Cladophora bloom, that's the green stuff. And then in the early 2000s, 2003, 4, or 5, you start to see thick mats of Acanthoptera and other seaweeds kind of filling in. You notice the coral itself becomes more and more fragmented. In the later years, after the rules went into effect, you can see some new corals settle out and grow, a little bit of the complex structure slowly starting to come back. And there's no fleshy seaweed, no macroalgae growing in the area. There is still turf, so there's a little fuzzy brown coating on the bottom, but it appears to be kept in control by those grazing fish we talked about, the schools that swim around in the area. Some of the big finger coral reefs used to look like this, right? You had mats of seaweed kind of filling in between all of the fingers. Fast forward to today, and what we're seeing is more of this, right? So that space between the fingers of the coral has opened up. There might be fine turf algae, but a lot of that pink and purple crustose coralline algae is much more visible. And to give you another view of what that looks like, on the bottom right, you can see an area that's covered with that crustose coralline algae. In short, the reef was struggling, battling with algae growth. The management action we put in place had some significant change effects on the increasing herbivores. And with those increased herbivores, we see that the benthos or the substrates start to change in a form that's much more appropriate for corals to survive and start to thrive and settle and grow. And with this, I'm going to pass off to my colleague from West Hawaii to talk a little bit more about specific species that we're looking at better managing.
Hi everybody, my name is Chris Teague. I'm a DAR biologist in West Hawaii. Today I'd like to talk to you about which species we're considering and which tools that DAR can use to protect herbivores. So which herbivores are we most interested in for increased protection? Our focus is on species that are targeted, and we're trying to make sure we include species from each of those different types of herbivores. For some, like surgeonfishes, this will be on a species by species basis. For others, we'll likely consider species as part of a larger group. The main groups of fishes that we're considering are surgeonfishes, uhu, and nenue. We're considering urchins as well, since they are also important herbivores on our reefs. For surgeonfish, we're looking at key individuals from across those different herbivore functional groups. Umomole and kala are important browsers feeding on larger seaweeds. Manini, pakuikui, and lauipala are grazers that feed on small turf algae. And kole and black kole are detritivores that are helpful for cleaning sediments off of the reef. For uhu, it really makes sense to split these species up into two groups, the large-bodied and the small-bodied uhu. These groups play different roles on the reef, where the large species tend to be scrapers, and the small-bodied uhu tend to be either grazers or browsers, depending on their life stage. Nenui will likely be managed as a single family. These species look very similar and are hard to tell apart. In addition, they have pretty similar ecosystem functions. For sea urchins, we're actually looking at all species for increased protections. So how can we better protect herbivores? Today, we're really working on updating regulations for these key species, but this effort alone won't reverse changes to Hawaii's reefs. There's still more work to be done for the protection of herbivores, and we'll need to rely on other management strategies in addition to what we're talking about today. In a separate process, we're also going to be working on place-based regulations. DAR will be coming out for public meetings to discuss the Marine 30 by 30 effort, and this will focus on creating additional protections for specific reef areas. In order to protect herbivores, DAR has a number of options for setting rules. These include size limits to let small fish grow or large fish reproduce, bag limits to limit overharvesting, seasonal closures to give fish a rest period during spawning or reproduction, gear restrictions to make sure fishing gear isn't overly harmful, and area restrictions to give certain places increased protections. And with that, I'll hand it over to Heather on Kauai.
Hi, I'm Heather Ilatala Ward, and I'm an aquatic biologist on Kauai. I'm going to go over the public scoping process and how you can get involved. This slide shows the process that rules go through in order to become a law. You can see that it is a lengthy process with a lot of steps. The important thing to get out of this slide is that we are here in the very first stage where we are getting public input. We haven't made any decisions about any rules yet. We want your input before we move forward. This step is the scoping meetings where the public gives insight and input into potential rules. So how can you give us input? We are going to have virtual meetings through Zoom for each of the district offices, East Hawaii, West Hawaii, Maui Nui, Oahu, and Kauai. If you're interested in participating in these scoping meetings, the dates and times will be posted on DAR's website, which is at dlnr.hawaii.gov/DAR. You can also go to the 30 by 30 initiative page through the DAR website, where you can find more information and register for the meetings. It's important that you register if you'd like to participate in the scoping meetings. If you're unable to participate in any of the proposed scoping meetings, don't worry. You can still provide input to DAR. You can do that by submitting written comments through a comment box on the 30 by 30 website, or you can call or email your district aquatic biologists. We have them listed here, but we'll also have the information on the website, so you don't have to scramble to write down the information right now. So to reiterate, this scoping process is really to get public input on what management tools DAR should use. We know that successful resource management requires public support and compliance, which is why we're reaching out to you. What types of rules will you support? To recap how you can get involved, you can participate in a scoping event. You can submit written comments through the comment box on the 30 by 30 website, or you can reach out to your island district biologists and outreach staff at the Division of Aquatic Resources. So today, Troy started us off by talking about what DAR's mission is as a division within the Department of Land and Natural Resources. Then Russell gave you some background into coral ecology and herbivores and why they are important. Chris gave you the information about which herbivores we are focusing on and what rule options we potentially have as the Division of Aquatic Resources. Then I summed up by discussing how the public process works and how you can get involved. Again, I want to thank you all for joining us. We really appreciate your participation and input into this public scoping process. Your input is invaluable.